So our next speaker is Liz Carlisle, who is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She teaches courses on food and farming. She's originally from Montana, where she's collaborated on research and publications with farmers in her home state. And more recently, you might have heard of Liz for some of her books. She's written 3, Lentil Underground, Grain by Grain, and then more recently, Healing Grounds, which is the title of our talk today, Climate, Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. It's actually sitting on my bookshelf behind me, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to this talk.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Will. Thank you for the invitation, Will and Rose. It's great to be here with everybody. And Ash, I so enjoyed that talk. That was really insightful to hear about your work. And yeah, bravo, really ambitious and courageous and awesome. So I'm just going to dive in here, let you know a little bit about what I've been working on recently. So I'm really interested in this question about agriculture. I come, my home state, as Will said, is Montana. So I come from an agricultural place. My grandmother lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. And I think that's the reason why this is the question at the heart of my research and writing. And this question has become a bit more prominent in recent years. This incredible group of scientists from around the world has studied this question of how we might not only mitigate greenhouse gas emissions through a regenerative agriculture, but even think about drawing down some carbon. Prince Charles got excited about it. The French government got excited about it. But at the same time, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there have been quite a few reservations from a number of our colleagues about the degree to which transitioning to a more regenerative agriculture can, in fact, help us, really take a bite out of our greenhouse gas emissions pie and sequester carbon. And so I found myself reading these kind of perspectives going back and forth and being really curious about, why is there this gap in our kind of collective belief about what is this percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that agriculture might be able to tackle? And is the reason for this gap that there are approaches to regenerative agriculture that are perhaps more powerful than others in terms of climate and also in terms of some other things we might want out of regenerative agriculture? And how can we sort of steer towards that? And so with my most recent book project, I had an opportunity to have some really deep conversations with 4 women in particular, who I see as really massive leaders in regenerative agriculture. And I think their work is really indicative of this approach that I've been trying to move toward. So first, I met Latrice Tatsey, who is a soil ecologist from Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana, whose research focuses on the carbon sequestration potential of regenerative grazing. And like many regenerative grazing experts I've met, Latrice is a cattle producer who advocates for rotating livestock through pastures in patterns that mimic the movements of native herbivores so as to regenerate vegetation and ultimately soil carbon. But for Latrice, native herbivores are more than just a theoretical model. Bison, or ini, as Latrice's people call them, are considered relatives and are central to everything about life at Blackfeet Nation, as they are for many people indigenous to the North American prairie: economy, diet, cultural, and spiritual traditions. So Latrice isn't just using historical bison grazing as a model for how to manage cattle. She's part of an effort to restore bison on the North American landscape, not just within the contemporary Blackfeet Reservation established by the US government, but throughout the historical territory of both her people and these native herbivores with whom they're so closely connected. And she speaks of bison as teachers that help her also in her work as a cattle rancher. I also got to know Olivia Watkins, who farms mushrooms within a patch of forest in North Carolina that her family has managed for more than 130 years. So when Olivia's great-great-uncle bought the place in 1890, he became one of the first Black landowners in the area. And in the midst of rampant racial discrimination and outright racial violence, during a century when 98% of Black landowners were forcibly dispossessed of their land, This forest plot was a place of relative sanctuary for Olivia's ancestors, who initially lived off the land. And now, as the Research Triangle area of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill is rapidly urbanizing, Olivia's land is one of the few pockets of diverse natural forest remaining, and thus also a sanctuary for wildlife and soil carbon. So for Olivia, forest farming and agroforestry are a means of conservation in at least two senses. As she conserves threatened forest, she's also conserving threatened Black-owned land. And then closer to where I live and work in California, I met Aide Guzman, an ecologist conducting a first of its kind study with immigrant farmers in California's Central Valley. So not very many people were looking for biodiversity in Central Valley agriculture, but Aide Guzman knew that there were hidden hotspots of biodiversity amidst the monocultures of almonds and grapes because she herself grew up in the Central Valley, the daughter of farm workers who immigrated from their family's diversified small farm in Mexico. And she knew there were many families like hers, families with deep cultural traditions of growing multiple crops in diverse mixtures or polycultures, families who were farming this way on whatever patches of earth they could find. To Esch's point about urban gardening, often as a place where these plants and the people who tend them, find a place of refuge. So using satellite maps and driving for hours down country roads, Guzman identified dozens of small farmers who agreed to participate in her study, comparing polycultures to monocultures. And the polycultures, Guzman found, provided much better habitat for specialist native bees, and also 2 times as many types of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi were in these polyculture plots. So it says a lot about potential soil ecosystem function. And then I also spoke with one of Aide's neighbors. So just down the road from the little town of Firebaugh, California, where Aide Guzman grew up, Nikiko Masumoto cultivates 80 acres of peaches, nectarines, apricots, and raisin grapes, the 3rd generation to steward her family's Del Rey, California farm. Nikiko's grandparents bought the land and planted the first trees. Her dad, Moss, converted the farm to certified organic production some 30 years ago. And walking the same land as those who came before her, Nikiko thinks a lot about her ancestors. So many of the methods that develop soil take time. The horizon is long, Nikiko told me. When you're wanting to leave a farm to several generations in the future, you have a vested interest in taking up those practices. But digging into her family's history is also a painful and complicated process. Discriminated against as immigrants, Nikiko's great-grandparents never owned the land they worked. What little savings they had built up was lost during Japanese-American internment, when some 120,000 people, most of them US citizens, were incarcerated for years simply because of their Japanese descent. So Nikiko's grandparents had to start from scratch, eking out a living on marginal land as they gradually built up the soil. And that was a really big deal. Nikiko talks about it as claiming belonging in this soil, believing in a future where your children and grandchildren would reap the benefits of these soil building processes that are really this kind of intergenerational project. So speaking to these 4 regenerative agriculture leaders filled me with hope. Each one of them laid out a powerful vision for how regenerative agriculture could significantly address climate change, and they were already putting these plans into action, restoring prairies, conserving forests, and demonstrating the benefits of planting polycultures and cycling nutrients. But they also made me think differently about what regenerative agriculture is and what it needs to be in order to truly address climate change and shift the destructive course of agricultural business as usual. So I would say the first key lesson I learned from the regenerative agriculture leaders I spoke to for this research is that regenerative agriculture is not new. So certainly, strategies like cover cropping and regenerative grazing may be new ideas to many farmers in the global north, who've often been taught that soil fertility comes out of a package and monocultures are more efficient. But this industrial approach to farming is really only about 75 years old. So really just a minor blip in the long history of human land management. And meanwhile, indigenous food systems have employed what we now term regenerative practices for thousands of years. So for example, on this continent in North America, indigenous people have long understood the regenerative relationship among prairies, grazing, and fire. The African continent, among many, many other regenerative traditions, has a long history of agroforestry, a practice that continues throughout the African diaspora. And of course, the rest of the Americas, beyond just the North American continent, polycultures are a staple of indigenous food systems throughout Turtle Island, Central America, South America. And particularly, many people think of this three sisters trio of corn, beans, and squash that spread throughout, I love this term, what scholar Devin Pena terms the indigenous corn belt, long before European contact. And then I think also really important to remember that these classic books that inspired the organic farming movement in the US and United Kingdom were all written by either American or European scientists who went and observed smallholder farming practices in different parts of Asia, came back and shared what they learned. So the Asian continent really has a very prominent place in the kind of origin of these practices, as they're now utilized by a lot of organic farmers in the US and the UK and Europe. So these are just a few examples among many that I came across in the course of my research. But the key point when we're thinking about the regenerative agriculture movement, particularly in the US, I think is this, that regenerative agriculture is rooted in the ancestral knowledge of indigenous communities and communities of color. And it's essential to recognize, credit, and take leadership from these indigenous communities, folks indigenous to this continent, as well as indigenous communities that are in diaspora, really because of a legacy of colonization and empire. And to really just call it out, like, why have we had this history of extractive agriculture on this continent for the past 400, 500 years? To really see that extraction exists for a reason. It's a tool, it's the playbook of colonization. All that soil carbon that was lost from US farmland over the past few centuries, that was part of a larger process of extraction, a process of stealing land, resources, and even people. A process of exporting wealth out of communities and concentrating it in the hands of a powerful elite. So if we want to reverse processes of extraction and instead have processes of regeneration, we really have to deal with that whole complex, not just look at the plants as an isolated case, but see that that wasn't an accident, that it was driven by these larger processes. And so I did get to know a couple of really amazing organizations that are working on regenerative agriculture from this lens. So this is Minnow in California that works to secure land tenure for farmers of color and indigenous communities in California. Also, the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust does similar work in the Northeastern United States, really thinking about how regenerative agriculture can tackle land justice and to make it possible for all these communities that have been doing regenerative practices for all these thousands of years, all these hundreds of years in the face of colonization and resistance to colonization. How do we ensure that people have the land and the agency and the capital and all the things that they need to lead? I love this quote from Stephanie Morningstar of Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust about what is really at the heart of regenerative agriculture, or really most of our projects in response to climate change, is that we are healing our ancestral lineages. And so this really is a very large society-wide, multiracial, multi-ethnic project. And so bringing it back to our conversation here today and this wonderful, workshop that our organizers, Will and Rose, have convened, I just wanted to make a couple points relative specifically to our gathering today. And what does this look like for folks in the plant sciences? First, I just wanted to, around this term decolonization, remind us of this amazing paper from Tuck and Yang that I think really defines it in a way that I found it helpful to come back to. Tuck and Yang lament the fact that decolonization is often used as a metaphor for various things, particularly in the academy, but to remember that it really requires the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. And I think those are things we're actually well positioned to do in the plant sciences, as I think Esh actually laid out quite helpfully there. And also, I did also want to bring out a couple elements of some of these key papers that the organizers sent around in convening this conversation. Some of these ways of thinking about, repatriating Indigenous land and life. I love this concept of changing the terminology around orphan crops research and instead discussing Indigenous crops research, and then everything that actually means in terms of the actions that we would take if we were really changing our mindset. I think it's really important to ask fundamental questions. And sometimes I think when we do more fundamental science, our institutions in no way encourage us to ask these kinds of questions. I think our training often kind of, moves us along with a set of assumptions that we aren't necessarily even really given the tools to think about questioning. But I think, to Will's point about this moment of reflection in the sciences, I think it is important continually to think about when we do fundamental science, whose goals are we pursuing? Oftentimes fundamental science is cast as this kind of neutral endeavor, but it has a whole theory of change underlying it. And so I think it's important that we're intentional about what that theory of change is. And sometimes, with deep humility, to even ask if the particular form of fundamental science that we're trained in is the right tool for addressing the challenge at hand. And here I would point to, really big global discussions about global food security and the way in which sometimes I think scientists are eager to say, we have the solution to this. And sometimes that can undermine people's political struggles for food sovereignty or more, governing power over their own communities. So knowing when we do or do not have the right tool, or when maybe we need to collaborate with others. And then just a few thoughts, not necessarily from myself, but from the field of agroecology that I'm part of about applied plant science. So those are some kind of questions that I think are really important for fundamental science, but some promising pathways I think for applied plant science include working with open pollinated and locally adapted varieties, where communities have this agency over, how they're continuing to shape those plant populations. Similar with population level breeding for horizontal resistance, keeping that kind of flexibility in our genetic pool in terms of, the work that we might do in agriculture. I'm a really big fan of participatory plant breeding. Also, this project around open source varieties. If you haven't seen the open source seed pledge before, I've got a picture of what that looks like on a seed packet and their website. In situ conservation, so actually I think those urban gardens that Esh was showing us are really an important form of this. The idea that biodiversity exists in relationship with peoples, and it's really important that we not just imagine that it's going to be in a vault somewhere, but that it really is, continually in relationship with people and adapting to new, both environmental and social conditions. And then I've also been really excited about recent conversations about Indigenous benefit sharing agreements and seed rematriation. And I would really credit Rowan White with Sierra Seeds as having driven a lot of these conversations. And this is something that some of the, I think, more progressive elements of the seed trade are looking at in terms of thinking about who generated the, intellectual property, if we even want to call it that they are selling. So that's it for me. I will stop my screen share here, and thank you so much for welcoming me into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Liz. for your thoughts. That was a really amazing talk. Really enjoyed hearing a little bit about the thoughts that went behind your amazing book, and we'll recommend it to anyone who's interested in these ideas.